Hello, everyone.
Do you ever feel like something is brewing beneath the surface, something you can't control? That was exactly how I felt the moment Ethan asked me that question. His voice was low, almost conspiratorial, as if we were sharing something forbidden, something we weren't supposed to acknowledge. Ethan wasn't just anyone. He was my stepmother's new husband. A man I barely knew, yet somehow he had this unsettling ability to get under my skin. He wasn't supposed to matter to me, and I wasn't supposed to feel anything around him. But here we were, standing in the middle of the dimly lit living room, and suddenly, every breath felt too loud, too noticeable. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, pretending his question hadn't rattled me. But my fingers tightened around the edge of the table, betraying my nerves. "You know exactly what I mean," he said, taking a slow step closer. His eyes didn't waver, locked onto mine with a look that was far too intense for comfort. This tension between us. Don't tell me you haven't felt it. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat louder than the last. I wanted to deny it, to laugh it off and walk away like none of this mattered. But I couldn't. Because deep down, I had felt it too. Every accidental touch, every lingering glance, it had been there, growing, waiting for one of us to finally acknowledge it. "This is ridiculous," I said quickly, turning away from him, hoping to end the conversation before it went any further. "You're imagining things." "Am I?" he pressed, his voice soft but insistent. "Then why are you so nervous right now?" I froze. He was right, and that only made things worse. I could feel his presence behind me, too close for comfort, too close for what was supposed to be a simple family dynamic. My mind screamed at me to leave, to put distance between us, but my feet refused to move. "I think you should go," I said finally, forcing the words out even though my throat felt tight. "I'll go," he said, his tone calm, almost too calm. "But don't pretend this conversation never happened. You felt it, just like I did." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, heart racing, mind spinning. I told myself he was wrong, that it was nothing, just a weird moment blown out of proportion. But deep down, I knew better. I knew this was just the beginning of something I wasn't ready to face. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard his voice again, saw the way he looked at me, felt the tension that hung in the air between us. It was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. And yet, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next morning, I forced myself to act normal. I went downstairs, plastered on a smile, and sat down at the breakfast table like nothing had happened. My stepmother was already there, cheerfully pouring coffee and talking about her plans for the day. Ethan sat across from me, calm and composed, as if last night hadn't happened at all. I avoided his gaze, focusing instead on my plate, pretending to be engrossed in my food. But I could feel his eyes on me, feel the tension that hadn't gone away. It was suffocating, and I hated how much it affected me. "Are you okay?" my stepmother asked, noticing my silence. "Yeah, just tired," I lied, forcing a smile. "Didn't sleep well." "Well, maybe some fresh air will help," she suggested. "Why don't you go for a walk later?" "Yeah, maybe," I said, desperate for any excuse to escape the house and him. After breakfast, I grabbed my coat and headed out. The cold morning air hit my face, sharp and refreshing, but it did little to clear my mind. I walked aimlessly through the quiet streets, trying to shake off the lingering thoughts of last night. But no matter how far I went, they followed me, clinging to me like a shadow I couldn't escape. "This is getting out of hand," I whispered to myself as I sat on a park bench, staring at the empty playground in front of me. I needed to get a grip, to stop letting this, whatever it was, mess with my head. Ethan was just a man. A man married to my stepmother. Nothing more. But the memory of his words, the intensity in his eyes, refused to fade. And the worst part? A small, treacherous part of me didn't want it to. When I finally returned home, the house was quiet. My stepmother had gone out, leaving Ethan and me alone. I considered going straight to my room, avoiding him altogether, but before I could make a move, I heard his voice. "Hey," he said, standing at the foot of the stairs. "Can we talk?" I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest once again. I knew I should say no, walk away, and put an end to whatever this was before it got any worse. But instead, I found myself nodding, unable to resist the pull that had been growing between us. "Fine," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could. "But make it quick." As I followed him into the living room, I couldn't help but feel like I was walking into something I wouldn't be able to walk away from. And trust me, this is only the beginning. What happened next? Things got even more intense, more complicated, and way more dangerous. The next morning, I woke up hoping that everything that happened last night had been just a strange dream. But the moment I walked into the kitchen and saw Ethan casually sipping his coffee, reality hit me with full force. His eyes met mine, and for a brief second, I saw it again, that tension, the unspoken something between us that I had tried so hard to ignore. But ignoring it didn't make it go away. If anything, it only seemed to make it stronger. Mom, as always, was cheerful and oblivious. She chatted about random things, smiled as though everything was perfectly normal. I tried to focus on her words, on anything but the way Ethan's gaze lingered just a little too long before he turned back to his coffee. I couldn't bring myself to meet his eyes again. Not after last night. But the silence between us, heavy and unrelenting, was impossible to escape. "So, any plans for today?" Mom asked, pouring herself another cup of coffee. Her voice was light, carefree, as though nothing in the world could be wrong. "I might go for a walk," I said quickly, my voice strained despite my best efforts to sound casual. "Just need some fresh air." "That sounds like a good idea," she said with a smile. "It's such a beautiful day." Beautiful? Maybe to her. But to me, everything felt suffocating. I needed to get out, to breathe, to think clearly. Without waiting for any further conversation, I grabbed my coat and headed out, leaving them behind in that too-perfect kitchen. The cold air outside was refreshing, sharp against my skin, but it did little to clear my head. No matter how far I walked, my thoughts kept circling back to Ethan, to the way he had looked at me, to the way he had spoken. It wasn't just what he said, it was the way he said it. Calm, certain, as though he knew exactly what I was feeling, even when I wasn't sure myself. This tension between us, don't tell me you haven't felt it. I hated how those words echoed in my mind, how they made my heart race every time I remembered them. I hated that he had made me feel this way, confused, vulnerable, and drawn to something I knew was dangerous. I wandered through familiar streets, hoping the rhythm of my steps would steady my racing thoughts. But it didn't. The more I tried to push it away, the stronger the memories became. Why did he have to say it? Why couldn't he have just let things stay as they were, silent, unspoken, but bearable? Now, every glance, every accidental brush of his hand felt different, charged with something I didn't want to admit. By the time I returned home, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the street. I hesitated before opening the front door, taking a moment to steady myself. I told myself that everything would be fine, that I could handle it. I just had to avoid him, keep my distance, and pretend like nothing had happened. But the moment I stepped inside, I knew that wouldn't be so easy. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Mom's car wasn't in the driveway, which meant she wasn't home. My heart sank. I hadn't expected to be alone with him. I thought I'd have more time before I had to face him again. I took a deep breath and walked toward the stairs, determined to head straight to my room. But before I could make it, I heard his voice behind me. "Did the fresh air help?" he asked, his tone calm, almost too calm. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. He stood at the bottom of the stairs, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. There was no trace of the tension from last night, but that only made me more uneasy. "It was fine," I said, keeping my voice as neutral as possible. I just needed to clear my head. "Did it work?" he asked, taking a step closer. His voice was steady, but there was something in his eyes that made it impossible to look away. "I don't know," I admitted quietly. It was the truth. My head wasn't clear. If anything, it was more muddled than ever. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, thick with everything we weren't saying. I knew I should walk away, end this conversation before it went any further. But I didn't move. "Look," he said finally, breaking the silence. "I didn't mean to make things awkward. I thought we should be honest about what's happening." "There's nothing happening," I said quickly, too quickly. The words felt forced, and I hated how unconvincing they sounded. He didn't argue. He didn't need to. The way he looked at me, calm and knowing, said enough. He didn't believe me, and maybe I didn't either. "You're right," he said after a moment, his voice soft. "Maybe I'm imagining things." I should have felt relieved. He was giving me an out, a way to pretend that none of this was real. But instead, I felt disappointed. And that scared me more than anything. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. My mind replayed our conversation over and over, analyzing every word, every glance, every subtle shift in his tone. I hated how much space he was taking up in my thoughts, how I couldn't seem to push him away. Maybe I'm imagining things. Was he? Or was I just too afraid to admit that he was right? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that this wasn't over. Not even close. By the time I got home that evening, all I wanted was to avoid Ethan entirely. I clung to the hope that maybe I could slip into my room unnoticed, avoid another tense conversation, and pretend things were normal for just a little while longer. But fate had other plans. Mom was out, her car wasn't in the driveway, and the house felt unnervingly quiet. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the anxiety bubbling in my chest. "Just go to your room. Don't stop. Don't talk to him." I repeated the thought over and over like a mantra as I headed toward the stairs. But before I could reach my door, his voice stopped me in my tracks. "We need to talk." His tone was calm, measured, but I could hear the tension beneath it, like a string pulled too tight. I turned around slowly, forcing myself to meet his gaze. He stood at the bottom of the stairs, hands casually tucked into his pockets, but there was nothing casual about the way he looked at me. His eyes held that same intensity one had been trying so hard to ignore. "About what?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, though inside, everything felt like it was unraveling. "About what's happening between us," he said simply, taking a slow step closer. "You feel it too, don't you?" His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was imagining things, that this was all some twisted misunderstanding. But the truth lodged itself in my throat, impossible to swallow. "This doesn't matter," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But even as I said it, I knew how weak it sounded. "It does," he countered, his tone soft but firm. "We can't keep pretending it doesn't." I took a step back, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. I didn't want to have this conversation. I didn't want to admit that there was something between us, something neither of us could control. But there was no escaping it now. "You're married to my mom," I said quietly, hoping that saying it out loud would make it real, make it enough to stop whatever was happening. "This is wrong." "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He took another step closer, closing the distance between us. "But that doesn't change how we feel." I hated how calm he sounded, how certain he was. It made it harder to hold on to the thin thread of logic I was desperately clinging to. "This can't happen," I said, more to myself than to him. "I'm not saying it should," he replied, his gaze never wavering. "But we can't keep ignoring it either." The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel my pulse in my ears, each beat a painful reminder of how close he was, of how much I wanted to run but couldn't. I should have walked away. I should have ended the conversation right then and there. But instead, I stayed rooted to the spot, caught between fear and something far more dangerous. "We're just confused," I said finally, grasping at anything that could make sense of the mess we were in. "This will pass." "It has to." "Maybe," he said quietly. "But until it does, we need to be honest with ourselves." I didn't respond. I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew he was right. No matter how much I wanted to deny it, there was something between us. And it wasn't going away. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. My mind replayed our conversation over and over, analyzing every word, every glance, every unspoken moment in between. I hated how much control he seemed to have over my thoughts, how I couldn't seem to push him away. The worst part was, I didn't know if I even wanted to. The next day, things only got worse. Every time we were in the same room, the tension was palpable, a heavy weight pressing down on both of us. We barely spoke, but we didn't need to. The unspoken connection between us was undeniable, and it was driving me insane. I tried to keep my distance, to avoid him as much as possible. But it was like trying to fight gravity. No matter how hard I tried, I kept getting pulled back toward him. And I hated myself for it. That evening, Mom went out again, leaving Ethan and me alone in the house. I tried to distract myself, to keep busy with anything I could find. But nothing worked. The silence was suffocating, and every sound seemed amplified, making my heart race with anticipation. I knew he was still here, just a few rooms away. And that knowledge was enough to set my nerves on edge. Finally, unable to take it anymore, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat down in the living room, pretending to watch TV. But my mind was elsewhere, caught in the whirlwind of emotions I didn't know how to handle. "Mind if I join you?" Ethan's voice broke the silence, making me jump slightly. "Sure," I said, forcing myself to sound casual, though my heart was racing. He sat down next to me, not too close, but close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence. For a while, neither of us said anything. The only sound was the low hum of the TV, filling the space between us. "I didn't mean to make things harder for you," he said quietly, breaking the silence. "You didn't," I said quickly, though we both knew it was a lie. He paused, as if searching for the right words. "I don't know how to stop feeling this way." His honesty caught me off guard, leaving me unsure of how to respond. I wanted to tell him I felt the same, that I didn't know how to stop either. But the words caught in my throat, too heavy to say out loud. Instead, I just nodded, my eyes fixed on the TV even though I wasn't really watching it. The silence between us stretched on, heavy and charged, and I knew that if I didn't leave soon, something was going to happen. Something I wasn't ready for. "I think I'll go to bed," I said abruptly, standing up and setting my glass down. "Good night, Anna," he said softly, his eyes following me as I walked away. But even as I climbed the stairs and shut the door to my room, I knew this wasn't over. Not even close. The following days felt like an endless test of my self-control. We barely spoke, but that didn't make it any easier. Every second we were in the same room was charged with tension so thick it was suffocating. Every accidental touch, every fleeting glance was a silent reminder of the thing we were both trying, and failing, to ignore. I tried to avoid him as much as possible, finding excuses to leave the house or stay in my room. But it didn't help. He was always there, in the living room, in the kitchen, in my mind. The worst part was that he didn't have to say anything to make his presence known. The air shifted whenever he was near, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop feeling that pull toward him. Mom, as usual, was blissfully unaware. She busied herself with work, errands, and chatting about everyday things, never once noticing the storm brewing just beneath the surface. I envied her ignorance. She had no idea what was happening right under her nose, while I was left to deal with a constant inner turmoil that only seemed to get worse with each passing day. One evening, after dinner, Mom went to bed early, leaving Ethan and me alone in the house. I stayed in the kitchen, nursing a glass of wine, hoping the quiet would help me gather my thoughts. But the moment I heard footsteps behind me, I knew any hope of peace was gone. Ethan walked in, his presence filling the room instantly. I didn't need to look up to know it was him. I could feel him, feel the tension building once again, wrapping around us like an invisible thread, pulling us closer. "You're still up," he said casually, but his voice carried that same underlying weight it always did when we were alone. "Couldn't sleep," I replied, keeping my eyes on the glass in my hand, avoiding his gaze at all costs. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked over to the counter, poured himself a glass of water, and sat down across from me. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, making my heart race despite my best efforts to stay calm. "We can't keep doing this," I whispered, breaking the silence. My voice was barely audible, but in the stillness of the kitchen, it felt deafening. "Doing what?" he asked, his tone soft but pointed. "This," I said, gesturing vaguely between us. "Whatever this is. It has to stop." "Do you really want it to stop?" he asked, his eyes locking onto mine, challenging me in a way that made it impossible to look away. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because the truth was, I didn't know what I wanted. Every rational part of me was screaming that this was wrong, that it needed to end before it went too far. But there was another part of me, the part that couldn't forget the way he made me feel, the part that didn't want to let go. "I don't know," I admitted quietly, the words feeling heavy as they left my lips. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving mine. "That's the problem, isn't it? We don't know what we want. Or maybe we do, but we're too afraid to admit it." His words hit me harder than I expected. He was right. I was afraid of what this meant, afraid of how much I wanted something I knew I shouldn't. The tension between us was unbearable, a constant weight pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. "This can't happen," I said again, though my voice lacked the conviction it had before. "I know," he said softly, his tone almost understanding. "But that doesn't make it any easier." We sat there in silence for what felt like an eternity, neither of us willing to break the fragile balance that hung between us. My heart was racing, my mind a mess of conflicting thoughts and emotions. I wanted to end this, to walk away and never look back. But I also wanted more. And that terrified me. "I should go to bed," I said finally, standing up and grabbing my glass. "Good night, Anna," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that lingered in the air long after I left the room. But even as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I knew it wasn't over. The tension, the unspoken connection between us, wasn't something that could be easily ignored or forgotten. It was there, growing stronger with each passing day, pulling us toward something inevitable. I hated how much space he occupied in my thoughts. I hated how every glance, every word, every moment alone with him made my heart race and my mind spin. But most of all, I hated that deep down, a part of me didn't want it to stop. The next day, things were even worse. Mom was out running errands, leaving Ethan and me alone in the house once again. I tried to stay in my room, to avoid him as much as possible, but it was like trying to ignore the elephant in the room. The tension between us was suffocating, and I knew it was only a matter of time before something happened. I found myself pacing back and forth, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't control. Part of me wanted to leave, to get as far away from him as possible. But another part of me wanted to stay, to see where this was going, even though I knew it was a dangerous path. By evening, the tension had reached its breaking point. I knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine, couldn't keep ignoring the way I felt every time he was near. Something had to give. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before it did. It happened faster than I could have ever imagined. One moment, I was standing a safe distance away, and the next, I was right in front of him, too close to pretend there was still any space left between us. His hand brushed against my face, light and hesitant, as if he was waiting for me to stop him. But I didn't. I closed my eyes as his fingers trailed along my cheek, sending a shiver through me that I couldn't hide. My breath caught in my throat, and for a brief second, I thought I might say something to stop this. But instead, the words that came out were a lie. "We shouldn't," I whispered, but even I could hear the lack of conviction in my voice. I didn't want him to stop, and he knew it. His lips hovered near mine, so close that I could feel his breath, warm and steady, against my skin. I knew this was wrong, knew that crossing this line meant there was no going back. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Logic, guilt, consequences, they all faded into nothing as his lips finally met mine. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if we were both testing the waters of something we weren't supposed to explore. But it didn't stay that way. It deepened, grew more urgent, more reckless, until it consumed every rational thought I had left. Afterward, I lay on my bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind a chaotic mess of emotions. Guilt gnawed at the edges of my thoughts, whispering that what I'd done was unforgivable. But it wasn't the guilt that scared me the most, it was the desire to do it again. I hated myself for wanting more, for not feeling as ashamed as I should have. My heart was still racing, my skin still tingling from where he had touched me, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't push the memory away. Ethan had left without a word, slipping away into his room and leaving me alone with the storm of emotions he'd stirred up. I knew everything had changed now. Nothing could go back to the way it was. And the scariest part? I didn't want it to. The next morning, I tried to act normal, but it was impossible. Sitting across from him at breakfast, pretending like last night hadn't happened, was unbearable. Mom chatted away happily, completely oblivious to the tension that filled the room. I forced a smile, nodded in all the right places, but inside, I was falling apart. I caught Ethan's gaze once, just for a second, and that was all it took to bring everything back: the kiss, the way his touch had made me feel, the way I hadn't wanted him to stop. I looked away quickly, my heart pounding in my chest, afraid that Mom might notice something if I wasn't careful. Every second dragged by, every moment a silent reminder of the secret we now shared. And the worst part? I didn't regret it. Not really. I knew I should, but I didn't. By the time evening rolled around, I was a mess of nerves and conflicting emotions. I told myself I'd stay in my room, avoid him entirely, and pretend like none of this was real. But when I heard his voice call out softly from downstairs, something inside me shifted. I hesitated for a moment, my hand on the doorframe, torn between the part of me that wanted to stay hidden and the part that wanted to go to him. In the end, I knew it was useless. The pull was too strong. I made my way downstairs slowly, every step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the bottom, he was there, waiting, his expression calm but his eyes betraying the same turmoil I felt. "We should talk," he said quietly, his voice steady, but there was an undertone of something deeper, something I didn't know if I was ready to face. I didn't respond. I just nodded, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything even more than it already had.
Bye.